ワールドデコーダー始まります。今回のテーマは米軍、アメリカ軍がいかに AI を戦争に使っているかです。アメリカにはですね、プロジェクトメイブンというある計画があってですね、これあんまり日本で知られてないんですが、この計画は2017年頃から始まったとされてまして、アメリカ軍がどんどん AI を軍事活用していったということなんですよね。で、実際これ戦争に使われてるんですが、ブルームバーグの記者のカトリナ・マンソンさんという人が、おそらく世界で最もこの謎のプロジェクトに迫った記者なので、彼女とアメリカと中継をつないでですね、このプロジェクトメイベンとは何なのか、どのように戦争で使われているのか、そして日本への影響は何なのか、徹底的に聞いてみたいと思います。では早速カトリーナをお呼びしましょう。So, Katrina Manson さん、welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
So, you are a journalist with Bloomberg and you cover AI, national security, and before that, you were with Financial Times, Pentagon correspondent, and now you're the author of your new book, Project Maven. And I read it, and unfortunately it's not translated in Japanese yet, but I highly recommend it to our audience. So before talking about your book, so in Japan, AI is a big thing right now, but last Friday, we were surprised to hear that the US government ordered Anthropic to, cut off Fable and Mythos from, foreign nationals, which meant that in Tokyo, we suddenly lost the latest AI model. So, in your book, you kind of lay out that AI is now a national security asset. Is this the world kind of your book predicted?
My book is really about the US military's development of AI targeting, actually for pairing AI-infused system with weapons on the battlefield. This, of course, about Anthropic is something slightly different. This is about a very advanced generative AI model that has now become so powerful and potentially so critical to national security that access to it may be limited. So there are certainly parallels. For me, I think what I'm really noticing is that these models now potentially have very significant cybersecurity implications. And of course, were they embedded in a military system that could do targeting, they could be much more powerful using one model than a different model. So you are now seeing this idea, which I do cover in the book, of algorithms potentially fighting algorithms and the real value attached to these. And of course, access to them and reliability to them is going to be a critical question, along with how reliable the actual technology is itself. So we're really walking through this morass now.
And I think our Japanese audience kind of understand that, AI is used in real battlegrounds, but I was surprised to read your book because there are real-life concrete examples. So could you explain to our audience what Project Maven is?
Yes, Project Maven is this effort that comes out of the Pentagon starting in 2017. And it's an effort to bring computer vision to drone video footage. The idea was that they had so many people, so much data coming in from drone videos, but not enough people to actually look at the feeds. And it was a very simple idea that computer vision should start finding objects on the screen. But it was actually about something much bigger than that. That was the narrow definition of the memo. It was an intelligence effort, a research and development effort. But really, I think it's fair to say, and certainly my research for the book revealed, that it was about putting AI at the heart of how America makes war. People associated with Project Maven started saying really quite early on that the Defense Department should never again buy a weapon unless it has AI in it. And I really set out to achieve, or to try and find out what that meant, what it meant to put AI into weapons, into the battlefield. And I discovered that Project Maven went further than just video footage from drones. It was also about bringing down images from satellites and using AI there, as well as translating text, captured enemy material from different languages and finding what might be interesting and even putting AI on the edge. So if you imagine a drone platform, putting AI on there as well. And increasingly, as AI itself has developed, Project Maven and the inheritors of Project Maven have tried to keep up too. And so it's not just computer vision, it's now also large language models, generative AI, really trying to speed up the way decisions can be made and thinking through the right course of action. One of the key things I think that I learned was from 2020 onwards, the US military started experimenting with computer vision against a sort of digital map, and then even pairing what could be found and located on that digital map with a weapon system. So you could potentially have a target identified by AI, then having it be hit by a number of different weapons platforms, whether drones, even submarines, they modeled it, B-52 bombers, fighter jets, a number of different platforms. And this has been part of an effort by the US military to develop a faster targeting cycle that can hit more things. But also its advocates kept stressing to me to be more accurate, to be more precise. And that's what I really set out to investigate in the book. Could it scale? Could it be faster? And could it really be more accurate, precise, and reliable, given we already know that AI is an unpredictable and often unreliable technology?
Right. So you said that Project Maven started in 2017, which is before ChatGPT, and now we're in 2026. Can you say that, like, in the US military, every soldier uses AI, or every weapon is connected to AI?
No, that is not the case yet, but there is certainly a vision for getting to that idea. You have the Pentagon in the second Trump administration asking every single person in the Pentagon to start using AI, large language models and agents even to do their work. So people who just come in essentially for the office job version of working at the Pentagon now have access to AI to help prepare their work. And they have more than 1.5 million people using it at work. At the latest count that I'm aware of, they had trained 26,000. So there's a shortfall, but there's great appetite to keep going forward. On the weapons side, there is experimentation of putting AI onto weapons platforms, and that can be for navigation and potentially in the case of autonomous systems or semi-autonomous systems, it can be to identify, locate and select a target for prosecution, for striking it. And one day potentially have no human in that decision-making system. But a human would still set the intention of the weapon and would potentially be able to oversee it. I've looked at a few different efforts to bring this into fruition. It's very hard. There are many challenges. Networking is difficult. The actual computer vision, recognizing the objects is very difficult. And then integrating technology with different platforms is proving very difficult. So it's really something that's underway at the moment. The system that has been more widely adopted is Maven's Smart System. This has come out of Project Maven. And if you imagine a digital map, almost Google Earth for war, that is the right kind of way to start thinking about it. It's a map that can be populated with information, locations of objects, and eventually can be paired with weapon systems. That, I'm told by US military commanders, the aim is that it will go faster and faster, and that one day war could take place without humans in that system, that it will become automated.
I'd like to ask you how we can put human in the loop later, but before that, when I was reading your book, it was interesting that a lot of tech companies took part in this Project Maven, this project, and companies like Google and Palantir. So could you explain to our audience how these tech companies, and even the differences, how they took part in this project?
Yes, when they started in 2017, the Pentagon was used to working with defense primes, big contractors, and a handful of them, Lockheed, Boeing, and they were not at the cutting edge of AI. So when the Pentagon started wanting to bring in cutting edge AI, they had to look elsewhere. And so they tried to get Google. At the time, one of the big backers of Project Maven really believed that Google was the best in the world, and he wanted Google DeepMind to work with the Pentagon on this effort. to bring their computer vision and other elements of AI into the Pentagon. Google DeepMind, he couldn't contact. He wasn't able to convince them. The founders of Google DeepMind had publicly said they wanted nothing to do with war. They had said they'd signed on to an open letter saying they didn't believe in AI tools that would be involved in war. And so the Pentagon had great difficulty actually in attracting some of those early companies. There's another department at the time in Google called Google Brain. They were also working on AI, but they also declined to work with the Pentagon. In the end, they started working with Google Cloud, which was a relatively new part of Google, focused on working with the government and with very few customers. So they said yes, but they didn't tell their workforce. And so you had this very complicated time where there were workers beginning to be asked to work on air-gapped systems, but not knowing why and becoming suspicious. And for some, in the end, thousands of Google workers, when they discovered that they were working on Project Maven, they themselves, their consciences were very affected. They didn't want to be working on what they described as the business of war. And so you had this real culture clash between those in the Pentagon who were arguing that they needed AI for national security, and those sometimes who weren't necessarily American or shared very different views, not wanting to work on AI in the military. And eventually this exploded in the US setting. It leaked to the media. Thousands of members of Google protested, some even resigned. Yeah. And ultimately, Google decided to establish a set of AI principles, not to make lethal weapons using AI, and decided not to renew its contract with Project Maven. And I think those 2 years, 2017, 2018, have become a sort of watershed in US military tech relations. And you can really date everything that's happened since to that moment, because it caused a huge shock for the Pentagon that there might be tools that they considered they needed for war, but they might not be able to access them because companies weren't prepared to work with them. This is where you get to Palantir, which you mentioned. So in 2018, the chief of Project Maven, after Google was showing dissent, called Palantir and said, could you help us? And Palantir said yes. Palantir had grown up as a startup deliberately serving the US intelligence community at a time that America was pursuing what it calls its GWAT, the global war on terror, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. And they began to get Palantir to replace some of the work that Google had been doing. Now, at the time, Palantir wasn't AI focused, but what they wanted Palantir to do was to create a user interface, this digital map that operators would be able to see targets on that map and then choose information. And that map would be fed by multiple different intelligence feeds and computer vision made by companies such as Microsoft, Amazon, and another startup in New York called Clarify, and other smaller competitors were all trying to create computer vision that would be the best. And they were competing every 3 months to see who was winning and who could improve the most. And so the Pentagon was really experimenting with an entirely different way of buying tech and beginning to realize that the suppliers of tech, as you mentioned in your very first question, might not always be as reliable as they might hope. But slowly, even Google has come back to them. And now today, with the second Trump administration, you see Google working on classified cloud, working on AI, and even providing agents across the Pentagon.
So I once interviewed Meredith Whittaker, who led the Google walkout, and she now runs Signal. And I know I've interviewed a lot of Google folks, and they don't want to be evil. And what's the difference between Google and Palantir, and what changed Google, or what's the difference right now?
I think it's a very interesting moment because Google has ultimately signed on to do classified work for the Pentagon for AI. And so they have really changed their outlook in the past 8 years since those Google protests. They are now signed up to do this. But they've had to change the way their company works. So now what they do is they segment the company. Google's federal business is clearly focused on the government. And so anyone who is recruited from the veteran community, for example, from the military forces, is signing up to work on that narrow element. other people who might have conscientious objections work on different parts of Google. But even now, you have seen at least one senior person resign from Google, according to reports, citing concern about working for the Pentagon and the way the Pentagon may be using AI at war, even today. And you've also seen hundreds of people protest from Google DeepMind, the very part that has the most sophisticated AI that has always been potentially more reticent than other parts of the company to work on defense issues. And I've recently covered a protest letter that urged the leadership of Google not to work on classified work for the Pentagon. So it is still a rumbling issue for them.
How about the public opinion? Because now people understand, they use ChatGPT every day and they understand this is a big thing and this is changing everything. And also China is also making DeepSeek and all those AI. So I think people kind of understand that maybe the US military should adopt AI in order to protect themselves or maybe even save human lives. Do you think the public opinions has also changed, or do you think we're in the middle of something?
I actually think there is so little in public about the way that AI is used in war that it's very difficult to have an informed opinion. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, to show the way that AI can fail at war, to show the way it may, in some cases, speed or scale or potentially contribute to accuracy at war. And it will very much depend on the way the Pentagon decides to use AI, which version of AI at war you end up having, and of course, what adversaries may do as well. Public opinion, my understanding, has been traditionally in the US a great reticence, a great nervousness about AI. That may be changing as people become more familiar with it, but of course the general public is not becoming familiar with AI at war. That's a very niche application and one that has profound implications really for society writ large. There are certainly still huge efforts at the United Nations, for example, led by the UN Secretary General, to try and get a ban on using autonomy, full autonomy on weapon systems, which can rely very heavily on AI. So I think you still see a very bifurcated picture. There's a coalition of more than 270 different non-governmental organizations under a banner called Stop Killer Robots, whose singular campaign issue is to try to prevent or to regulate the emergence of autonomous weapon systems, again, which can rely on AI. The more complicated area is looking at AI targeting, because it's neither one thing nor another, but it could have profound implications on the way that humans make decisions in war, speeding up war. And if I can give an example, I went to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency as part of my research, and they explained to me that before the US was using AI, they could comfortably hit 100 targets in a day. By adding in computer vision, they calculated they could get to 1,000 targets in a day. By adding in large language models, Claude and others, for example, they could speed up processes so much that they could get to 5,000 targets in a day. And if you look at what the US has said publicly about its military operations against Iran, the US hit 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours. There's public reporting, including from me, that the US is using Maven Smart System and Anthropic's Claude. And the CENTCOM commander has said that AI, a variety of AI tools, is helping them speed up processes, reducing that speed down from sometimes days and even weeks down to seconds. So the impact of AI on war is still clearly profound, but still very undercovered because so much of it takes place at a classified level.
And this is exactly the reason I wanted to interview you, because, I wanted to tell this story to our Japanese audience. Because in Japan, AI, there are a lot of business stories about AI, but it's basically talking about how it's making our workplace efficient, but it's also making the war efficient in a way.
That's the theory of the supporters, certainly. Right. And I think they found that in the past, humans were making so many mistakes. And so when you hear the arguments of those who support AI warfare against those who are extremely worried about it, and some of these people are in the military themselves, the ones who are worried about it, the argument of those who support it is precisely that war can be made more efficient. It will rely less on humans who are capricious, who get angry, who act from revenge. In fact, the AI may be easier to control. This is the aspiration. We don't know if that's the reality yet. And that AI can bring in so much more information and then present a more complex picture to a battlefield commander at the edge. And so the battlefield commander at the edge, the forces at the edge, will be less reliant necessarily on headquarters for an intelligence picture, but will have information at their fingertips. So that's really the hope. It relies on enormous amounts of effort to connect networks, to get those systems talking to each other. And it's work that the US will be undertaking for many years. But it's certainly the case that the second Trump administration wants to go very fast with AI adoption and has an effort to accelerate getting AI out to the battlefield. And for those who've worked on Project Maven, that is where they think the best learning can take place. It's much more risky. It's very unusual to be fielding that technology directly to the battlefield, but it's also where they discovered where things go wrong. And they have tried to learn very quickly and improve the algorithms, improve data collection, improve the human-machine understanding, all the things that would go into creating an AI system that could be relied on at war. They know that AI is capricious and may fail in multiple different ways. One of the examples I came across was actually that computer vision, certainly at the start, was not terribly reliable. It found difficulty identifying anything correctly. In one case, computer vision misidentified a cloud in the sky as a school bus. It sometimes mistook rocks for buildings. Vehicles and people could be confused for other objects. And even in one case, which I think is very important to explain, one algorithm vendor decided that it was so hard to tell the difference between humans that they would stop trying to identify men, women, and children, and instead would just say, here is a person. Now, their scores in the tests improved and they started doing better at the competition. But crucially, US operators make that check of how many women and children are in the vicinity of a potential strike before they take the decision to strike. And that is because they want to avoid collateral damage. They want to avoid killing civilians. If AI is not good enough to tell the difference between men, women, and children, they're not able to actually do that work. And so time and again, I found examples where the hopes for AI to be very specific also regularly failed. Even the chief of Project Maven would, in the early days at least, refer to AI as just a bag of potato chips, which is a very odd phrase, but I discovered that what he meant was the AI isn't good enough yet, but we want to create a system in which the AI can sit and that it will slowly get better. And we want our military operators to be ready for the day that it does become a system it can rely on. Even so, the most instructive example of where AI was used at war, except now for the Iran military operations, was in US support to Ukraine in 2022 when Russia fully invaded Ukraine. And initially, the computer vision algorithms were very poor at detecting the Russian tanks. They had been trained on the Middle East, on desert. They had been trained in the Philippines on green jungle. They were not used to snow, and detection rates fell from sometimes as good as 70% right down to 30% and sometimes even as low as 10%. The computer vision algorithms also were very poor at recognizing battle damage, which is a really important part of the US military assessment to see, have their munitions done the job they wanted them to do? What do we need to do for the next mission? And they couldn't recognize tanks when they had their turrets blown off. Now, these are things the US military learned about very quickly and tried to correct. So they brought in extra satellites, they took extra imagery, They took that imagery of the entire Russian arsenal, I learned, and sent that back to the algorithm vendors in the US, who overnight would work to try and update those algorithms so the computer vision could learn better. And lo and behold, eventually, over months, those computer vision algorithms started to be much better at detecting tanks. But there was still some important gaps. For example, the Russians use mobile missile launchers, which from above really just look like trucks. And so it's very hard to discern whether it's a truck, even a civilian truck, or if it's about to launch a missile. And it turned out that the military experts knew that the Russians arranged these mobile missile launchers, which are called TELs, transporter erector launchers, in a semicircle. But the algorithm vendors were never informed of that. Had they known, they could have created a computer vision algorithm that potentially could search for that shape in a semicircle to help narrow the effort to find the mobile missile launchers. So I did discover in multiple occasions that communication, even between humans, wasn't there, wasn't sufficient. And sometimes it was impossible. Perhaps the algorithm vendors didn't have the right clearance, weren't the right nationality, hadn't been read in on the information. But in the occasions where the algorithm vendors were able to share time and expertise with frontline forces, they learnt much more about how war works from a military perspective and could then try and adapt their AI to be more useful. And when it comes to what's happened in Iran, I think it will be really important to look at what lessons the US military is learning from their use of AI at war today as well.
What do you think the lessons the US military is learning through the war in Iran?
Well, the US has been very keen to stress quite how many targets they've been able to hit. It was 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours, 13,000 targets within little more than a month. And that pace, that scale is really a departure for the US. So they're very eager to emphasize that they've hit a lot. I have also noticed that the former defense secretary of the US military, of the US Defense Department, Jim Mattis, who was the defense secretary at the time that Project Maven got going, he recently said that targetry is no substitute for strategy, meaning, I think, that hitting lots of things doesn't necessarily get you to victory, to the outcome that you want. And the decisions that went into undertaking military operations, I think, will be very interesting to analyze, and what role AI has played. The other thing is that besides scaling and speeding war, I'm still not clear on whether it is helping with accuracy. Of course, there are multiple reports of civilian casualties in Iran. There is an investigation ongoing at the moment into what happened when a school was hit in Iran with 120 children killed. We don't know if AI played a role in that, but it will be very important to understand what decisions went into the targeting cycle, the intelligence collection, the decision to strike, clearly in error, what went wrong. And is there some combination of intelligence, speed, and decision-making that is not supporting accuracy? At the moment, I don't know the answer to that question. But I was recently with the former director of Project Maven, who's a retired Air Force general. And he said the whole point of AI at war had been to give extra time for human decision-making, because we know human decision-making itself can be flawed, to bring extra information and bring extra time. His worry, he said at this stage, was that instead of spending that time thinking better, the US military might instead simply try to do more, may try to shoot more things and not actually make better decisions. And so ironically, this former general, who is so devoted to developing AI warfare, has become concerned that ultimately it could lead to a flawed decision-making process. So I found that a very stark analysis from someone who has been a champion for developing this kind of technology.
I think that's a great point because, even us, like a regular person using AI in offices, AI is meant to make us more creative, but the irony is that people are just using AI to create a bunch of, AI flop. So I think it kind of illustrates that in the military, I think humans should have the time to think. But right now, it's going to an different opposite direction. Which direction is the US military heading right now?
Well, the Pentagon certainly is trying to speed up its adoption of AI and really accelerate it out to the battlefield. And this is backed not just by the Pentagon, but by the White House too. And they're currently reviewing their directive on the use of autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems. I've even reported on an effort by the Pentagon to create voice-controlled drone swarming tech. So there is an effort to really lean into this idea of AI and autonomy. At the same time, I've spoken to senior people who have explained to me that they are very focused on evaluation, on testing, that they need more, and that they're trying to understand the way that large language models will interact, how they can get the best out of it. And I'm constantly speaking to folks in the military or retired from the military who are concerned that, of course, the US might lean too far into AI. For some of the people I speak to from what is the Pentagon's Civilian Harm Unit, I was really struck by one argument that one former member made to me, which is that AI can be used to reduce civilian harm. It just needs to be decided that the military wants to use it in that way. It could flash up, for example, context clues. So in the example where a strike might be about to be undertaken, something that could be helpful would be flashing up that 70% of all vehicles in a specific country are white Toyota Corollas. This is a very complex, sad example because the US struck a white Toyota Corolla in 2021 in Afghanistan when it was withdrawing from Afghanistan in a very complicated situation. They thought they were about to be hit again a few days after a strike on Abbey Gate, where the US had lost personnel and more than 100 Afghans had been killed. But they followed a white Toyota Corolla for hours and decided to strike it, and initially described that as a righteous strike, and then subsequently said it, in fact, had been a tragic mistake because that white Toyota Corolla had belonged to an aid worker who was trying to get his family out of the country, and 7 children had been killed. I tried to find out if AI had been involved in that strike. My reporting is that no, it was not, and that Project Maven wanted to find those children. They even ran that footage again against computer vision algorithms, and the computer vision algorithms couldn't find the children. It was late at night. It was late on the turn from afternoon to evening. The shadows were very long, and the computer vision algorithms simply couldn't pick them up. Even analysts I spoke to couldn't pick them up by eye the first time around. And so I think one's going to find that there are limits to what computer vision and AI can do, but there may be ways in which computer vision and AI can be used to safeguard, to try and prevent mistakes by offering context to human decision making. It's really too soon to tell, but I have certainly met multiple people at the Pentagon who remain skeptical about AI and still want to experiment with it and see the best that it can be.
So I agree with the concept, human in the loop, even autonomous vehicles, we talk about human in the loop. But the difficult thing is that we have China and Russia, and they might be also building AI weapons, and it's like nuclear war. It's important to, strike first. So what if, China or Russia or other countries build an AI weapon and they're really fast, and if the US put a human in the loop, it will take time, it will slow it down. So what questions should we be asking? Because if it's only the US or democratic countries, it's important to put human in the loop. But if another country strike us first, that will be a very difficult situation.
2 parts to that answer. First of all, US military policy is not to have a human in the loop. Currently, the autonomous weapons policy is that there should be appropriate human levels of judgment over the use of force. That means a human is responsible, but it could mean in a supervisory way, watching, assessing what is happening, not necessarily making that decision. So already that policy for some semi-autonomous and autonomous weapon systems, which are subject to review, is already less than human in the loop. And that policy is also being currently reviewed. So we will see where the second Trump administration lands on that. In terms of US-China competition, that has been something that animated the team at Project Maven from the very outset. When the Pentagon was thinking about coming to AI and integrating AI into the way that it makes war, it was very much energized by a concern that China had been studying America's military weak points for a decade. And that although America had the most powerful weapons and easily the biggest budget that's spent on defense, China had been understanding where the vulnerabilities lay, and that there was a chance that China could develop AI weaponry. So this has animated the US military mind from the outset. I think one thing that was put to me is that, in fact, the US is far ahead of China when it comes to military AI, mostly because of the way it's been able to practice with it, because of experimentation, because of that access to war data, to use that war data to feed its own algorithms and become increasingly confident about the ways in which they can and can't be used. But at the same time, it was also put to me that China has a much faster development cycle. And so even if the US is ahead on the theory and the practice, often China can be the first one to actually field a weapon. So it's interesting to understand exactly what that rivalry looks like. Certainly the US has used fear of China to try to convince Congress and the US public writ large and technology companies that they should be working in support of these national security aims. On the China side, going back years, you can see an aspiration to bring AI into warfare. Chinese military documents talk about intelligentized warfare, about knowing what's potentially in the mind of your adversary, about doing somehow similar things to what the US is trying to achieve. I'm not clear on how advanced China is on that path, but certainly it's something that is animating the concern. And when I talk to military commanders about the defense of Taiwan, for example, almost uniformly, people talk about the need for autonomous weapons to defend Taiwan and for AI warfare, and that there is this idea that in any putative possible conflict between the US and China, that algorithms will be key, and that algorithms need to be updated on the fly whilst they're in use, and that they will constantly be being attacked by the opposition. They could be spoofed, they could be poisoned, and that algorithms really will be one day fighting algorithms. And I think that's certainly the idea that some US military commanders and thinkers have. And you see in the writings of some Chinese work, that's something that the Chinese military may be envisaging as well.
So two more questions. So when I was reading your book, I was surprised to read about Clarify, which was basically a company doing wedding blogs and good at identifying wedding cakes, which now switched to working with this Project Maven. So basically a startup going to a military company. So do you think, because a lot of our viewers work in the tech sector, do you think in the future there'll be a lot of startups which are not Boeing or which are not Lockheed Martin, but also will participate in this Project Maven?
Well, you will know far better than me the Japanese perspective on this, but I think it was interesting to learn how much Project Maven wanted the best. And so trying to convince some of the best image analysts, the best at image AI, to really change what they were doing and work also for the Defense Department was a very stark shift, a very unexpected transition. In the case of Clarify, the leader of that company had no connection to the US military at all. The most he'd ever experienced of war was sitting on his grandfather's knee and watching war movies. So it was a very significant shift for him. And he lost people. Some people in the workforce, again, protested about this. But ultimately, he made the decision that he thought it could help, that it would ultimately be useful for the company as well. And they've stuck with it. Other companies decide that's not what they want to do. And so, of course, it will come down to commercial realities and principles. And when you consider the position of Anthropic, an enormous frontier AI company, they were very comfortable working on classified networks for the US military. Their work is on Maven Smart System, but they drew a line elsewhere. They said they did not want their large language model to be involved in fully autonomous weapon systems. And of course, Anthropic's still essentially an enormous startup. It hasn't yet done its IPO. So I think you're going to see every company trying to decide what they're comfortable with. And equally, the Pentagon saying, if you work with us, we decide what is comfortable. We are going to decide. You can't give us a tool that you might take from us at any moment. And back to your very first question, of course, the US has now withheld Anthropic's most advanced model from the world. And so for people who rely on those models, they also have a question to consider about what that means. If you are going to use the most advanced technology in your military, and yet that most advanced technology could be pulled at any time, there is a question about reliability and continuity. And I think this is very much a period of flux and working that through.
And I think that leads to my final question, because Japan has no frontier AI, so we heavily rely on Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, etc. So how can Japan prepare? Because this is a national security issue.
Well, I'm just a reporter, as you know, so I try and find out what's happening and why and assess that. So it's not for me to in any way discuss what Japan might or might not like to do. One thing I have discussed with some of the earlier commercial entities who are trying to create new weapons of war using AI is their dependency on specific models and their fears that they may lose access to specific models. What some of those are doing is trying to work with open source models. So these are not likely to be the most sophisticated or advanced models, but the theory is that they will be able to maintain access to them. Now, of course, some of these models refuse to do defense work, and people are constantly trying to work ways around those prompts to get these models to do what they want. The other thing is I would be very interested to understand at the very top levels of the Japanese government if there is any discussion between Japan and the US over sustained access to US models and some sort of agreement. It is interesting if models can be whipped away from usage worldwide from US partners and allies, as well, of course, from US adversaries. And that also, we may see much greater levels of diplomacy focused on access to models. And that really will be a new global era.
Thank you so much, Katrina-san. So I highly recommend Project Maven to our audience. I think we should learn the facts first and start the conversation right now. So do you think this will be translated into Japanese?
Well, I understand that in future, at some point next year, there will be a Japanese language edition of the book. So I hope that will help your readers. But in the meantime, it is available in English in Japan.
Thank you, Katrina. I really enjoyed the conversation and I learned so much from you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.